Hi everyone, and welcome to our Christmas webinar, the last in our service design series of the year. Obviously, this is our Christmas special, and in a moment I'll tell you more about what that is. But just before we start, just to mention that in the corner, we've got our little bubble here, the orange circle, where you can ask a question. So at the end of the webinar, we're going to answer any questions that have come in during the session, but you can ask a question at any time just by clicking on there and asking your question. So our Christmas webinar, it's not about mince pies, presents, all those good things, but it's kind of connected to Christmas in that often at Christmas, we reflect on the year that we've just had, think about what was good, what we learned, and also think about moving ahead to next year. And that's what we've been doing at Hyphen8 in the service design team. We've been thinking about what's been on our mind this year, what have we been hearing a lot from our clients this year, and we've come up with our 12 queries of Christmas. So we're going to go through these in the session, and then, as I said, we'll have some Q&A at the end. So let me introduce you to the service design elves who are going to be taking us through the session today. So starting with Elaine, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, I'm Elaine. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Hyphen8, and I'm delighted that the service design team have invited me here today. Not least of which I get to wear my Christmas hat and jumper, but also because I'm extremely proud of where the service design team has come to by the end of this year. So we're really excited to share some of the points that we've learned.
Great, thanks Elaine. And then moving across, I'm the next angel along. So I'm I'm the next elf along, which I've been represented by an angel. So I'm Angela, I'm head of strategy and impacts, and I lead our service design team here at Hyphen8. I've been here for almost 2 years now, and previously worked for the National Lottery Community Fund and then a few other funders before that. And Kirsten.
Hi, I'm Kirsten. I'm a service designer, and I work with Ange on the service design team at Hyphen8, and I've been here since July. Prior to that, I worked at the National Lottery Community Fund for quite a long time, both on their service design team, generally developing funding processes, forms and programmes. And I also worked as a grants officer at the start, so back in the mists of time. So I've got quite a lot of experience of funding.
Brilliant. Thanks, Kirsten. And Kirsten's actually going to be our first query answerer. So let's bring up the first one and hand over to Kirsten.
So question number one that we've been receiving is, what is service design and why should we see what we do as a service? Yes, so, well, service design is just simply the design of services. And when we think about services, it could be anything from buying something from Amazon, booking a holiday, ordering some lateral flow tests, which I did yesterday online, or renewing a passport. And service design looks at processes sort of end to end and also back to front. So that includes all of the stakeholders, both the end users actually using that service, your customers, if you like, and the staff delivering it. And it tries to think about how we can deliver the best experience for everybody. So we've got a few points here to pick up on. One of them is we should have a service mindset. People often think services have to involve a paying customer, but that's not necessarily true. We see grant making as a service because it's a transaction that helps people to achieve a goal. We don't want to make it more difficult for people just because they're not paying customers. Having that service mindset means that we're thinking about creating a new product or improving a service. We've got those people in mind that we're serving, as well as the policy goals that we're trying to meet. And for most of the clients we work with, the people we're serving are applicants, grantees and colleagues. But the same also would apply to donors, contractors, customers, and the users of any process or service that an organisation provides. It's really important to think about who those people are. Funders can often provide a very good service to their boards, but not always to their grant-making staff or to grantees, as the entire process is designed to serve the board rather than the majority of the people interacting with it. Also, if we're thinking about what we do as a service, we can acknowledge that bad services are expensive, and they're expensive for everyone. If services aren't easy to use and understand, users can get frustrated and they're more likely to make mistakes, and that costs time and money. It makes it harder for everyone to reach their goals, and also for grant making to have the greatest possible impact. Basically, bad services are bad for everyone. They're expensive, they require more time investment from the point of the user, and then this has a knock-on effect on the user's ability to do other things, like spend time delivering their own activities or meeting their own objectives. And finally, services shouldn't discriminate. Services that don't consider their users are at risk of creating barriers, and this could be through overcomplicated processes that could end up inadvertently discriminating against people like newer organisations, smaller organisations, or just people and users that don't have the skills, experience, or the well-established processes of their own for actually dealing with them. So for all these reasons and more, thinking of what we do as a service has value, and service design helps us to think about our services as a whole from the point of view of everyone who interacts with them. So that's question number 1. For question number 2, we'll pass over to Ange.
Great. Thanks, Kirsten. So our second one here, why are our reports not telling us what we need to know? This is probably our most common question that's come up this year. And it's often articulated as, I've got a lot of data in my system. I know I'm collecting lots of stuff, but I still can't quite tell my impact, if it's like a grant maker or my reach. And I'm really struggling to make the best use of the data, and how can I make my data work better? So we've been thinking about this a lot this year. We've got kind of our 4 Christmas cracker tips that we've got on the next slide around how to address this. So the first one here is to start with the end, which maybe sounds a bit confusing, but what we mean by that is start by thinking about what you want to get out at the end of your service. So often when we're developing, let's say, a grant management service, we put a lot of time and energy into thinking about the application form, the assessment form, the decision, getting the right grants made, and that's really important. But we sometimes neglect to think about the end while we're doing all of that upfront design. And if we're not asking the questions, collecting the data that we need to be able to get this output that we want at the end, then we won't be able to understand what we want to understand from our data. So it's really important to consider the whole end-to-end of your service when you're designing it to make sure you get that data collection correct. The second one we've got here is think about how you will use your data. And I'd probably add think twice about how you will use your data. Just double think that, because one of the things that we see a lot is that people are collecting data that they just don't use, and it's really natural. You think, I'm going to need this data, but then you don't. So one of the things we've done this year is looked with funders at some of the data they're collecting in their application forms, in their report forms, and then had a little look at whether they actually use that data in their assessments or in their kind of monitoring processes. And quite often there's some data fields that just aren't being used, and they just clutter the system, make it more complicated for you to do your data analysis. So really think about the data that you want to have, and make sure you check that fairly regularly. So it's just natural over time that extra stuff gets added into a system or a service, and different layers get put in there. And maybe there's then also things that you're no longer using that you can take out. So just keeping your data as clean as possible can really help. Our third thing, make data collection easy. So you've done that thing of starting with the end. You've thought about what you need to have, and you've thought about the fact that you need to collect it. And then the next thing to do is to make sure it's as easy as possible for that collection to go well. So Kirsten's going to talk in a bit about forms and some of our tips around forms, but making forms work is really helpful in this area. And also recognizing where you've got mandatory fields, so things that you absolutely need for your end reporting, make sure that they're mandatory, they have to be collected, and that you have some validations where you can. So let's say if you're collecting date fields, that you've got a date field type so they come in the correct way, and the guidance is really clear so people are entering the data that you want them to enter. Then finally, bring your data to life. So as I mentioned before, there's often a lot of energy in that upfront application assessment bit, and we would recommend putting some of the investment and energy also into that end bit, because it really helps people when they can see data in an easy format and really see the impact of the services that they're offering. And we did a nice project this year with Cycling Scotland, where we helped them to look at some of their data. And on this next slide here, we've got a picture, a little image from one of the reports that we did for them. And this is just a really simple Google map showing where their projects are. It's really easy to create. And it just helps them to see at a glance where they're not funding. So where are their cold spots? And these are the kind of things it's just worth investing a bit of time in to create these easy to view dashboards and reports. So that ends number 2, and I'm going to hand back to Kirsten for number 3.
And number 3 is our old favourite, forms. So a question that we quite often get asked is, why don't our applicants answer questions how we want them to? And there could be a number of reasons for this. We explored quite a few of them more thoroughly in our forms webinar back in October. Some of you may have come along to that. So we'd just like to go through some of those key things that might prevent people from answering questions how we might expect. Number 1 is people skim reading long questions. So people read differently when answering questions online to when they're answering them on paper forms. And it could be that they're skim reading and not picking information up. You can see this ultra long question here with lots of different elements to it. Are you really going to manage to actually keep up with all of those and answer all of them easily. So keep questions short and try not to have too many on a page. And then our second tip is complex questions or jargon, and that's on the next slide. So it could not be clear what you're actually asking for, because complex questions might use a lot of jargon without clear guidance. Here you can see we're asking about KPIs. What is a KPI? Some people might not know. Is there a simpler way of explaining what you need to know? Ideally, guidance and explanation shouldn't be necessary, and the content of the question itself should be simple enough that people really understand what they need to answer. Another tip we've got is that content might not be suitable for the audience. So make sure you give enough thought to the audience for the questions. For example, if you've got lots of international applicants for whom English isn't the first language, do the references make sense to them? Are they relevant to them? You can see here that we've got our little elf. He's being asked a question about Companies House, but he's not from the North Pole. He's from the North Pole, rather, not from the UK. So for him, this question is irrelevant, and other users might be thinking the same. Next tip is it might not be clear why the information is needed, and this might be particularly true with things like personal or sensitive data. So here we've got a question that's asking Santa for his full legal name and date of birth. And Santa's a little bit offended that people might want to know his date of birth, because presumably he's pretty old. So he feels discouraged from actually answering there. People might be reluctant to provide it. So if you do need to collect some sensitive information, make sure that the reason for it is clear. Another common tip we've got is too many questions. So people can get fatigued by long forms with too many questions. I'm sure we've all experienced a bit of that ourselves, especially if those questions don't flow well or appear to duplicate each other or aren't relevant. We've got a couple of quick examples here that show a sign-up screen with a couple of questions on, which is much, much easier on the right-hand side, as opposed to on the left-hand side where we're asking for a large tranche of information at once. And our final tip is guidance. Guidance might not be accessible. It could be in a separate document rather than easily accessible near the original question. So your applicant might have missed it. And we understand that separate guidance documents is quite common, but they can be very long. People might skip them or might find it difficult to find them. And here we've got a picture of Santa, and he's got all the presents, but he's got no map or guidance immediately to hand to get him where he needs to go to deliver them. And possibly he's too busy trying to control those reindeer to actually go hunting for the map. We've worked with quite a number of clients to improve their forms this year, and we've helped one client in particular to reduce the number of questions on their form by looking at what the funders' grant staff could find already in the public domain, so they didn't have to ask the applicants for it. We also thought about what might be better picked up through conversations with applicants. So some of those more complex questions, rather than actually asking them on the form where the answers might not be right. We also reviewed the content of the forms to simplify the language. And we looked at how conditional questions on online forms could help reduce the number of irrelevant questions that a user sees. We're testing with a range of users because, as we always say, user testing is really important for making sure forms work well. And we're testing with users outside the UK as well, who might have different needs and a different understanding of those questions, so that if they don't make sense to them, we can adjust accordingly. We might need to do a different version for them. So all of these things are worth thinking about. And yeah, very common question this year. Back to Ange for our question number 4.
Thanks, Kirsten. So question 3, as Kirsten said, was one of our most asked questions. This one hasn't been a question that we've received a lot, but it's started to come up, and we think it's particularly interesting, so we've included it in our top 12 of the year. And it's, how can service design help in participatory grant making? And by participatory grant making, what we mean is moving some of the decision power, or all of the decision power sometimes, from the funder to the communities and those closest to the action to make the decision on where the funding is spent. And the quick answer to this is service design can help in designing this kind of grant making service in the same way that it could help in other services. So we would go through similar processes, but we've had a little think about how we would apply it particularly to participatory grant making. And we've got our 4 steps here on this slide. So our first one starts, as you would expect with service design, with some research. So we'd obviously want to spend plenty of time talking to the communities, those closest to the action, those people who are going to be involved in designing the grant service. but we'd also want to talk to wider groups of people, particularly we'd need to talk to people in the funder. So there may be some red lines, some risk things or governance things that you just can't avoid. They have to be done, whatever type of grant making is happening. And we'd need to know about those to factor those into the design of the service. So once we've done our research, we've started to get some ideas of what the grant making could look like. We would create a prototype and test it. So how we might go about this is we might set up some test applications, or however ideas are going to be surfaced. There might be videos or little presentations, or they could be in any format. And then we'd have a test decision panel or group or voting app or whatever it is that they come up with. And we'd test that process of how the grant making would work with not real life situations, but as close to real life as we could get. We'd learn from that, and then we'd iterate it until we got to a point where we're comfortable. The funders' governance structures are comfortable. Everybody's happy that we've got a process that can go ahead. And then we'd recommend starting small. So piloting with a small amount of grant funding, testing out that process for real, seeing how that works. There'll be some things inevitably that'll go better than others. There'll be some learning that we do. And then we would iterate that again, and we'd build from there until we can add more funding into it. So that would be our general process. And one of the things that we would recommend, which applies to all service design, is to be prepared for something different. So just this week, actually, we've been doing quite a bit of user testing with applicants and grant holders for different funders, looking at forms and processes. And it's always really interesting how different people will look at the same thing and have quite a different view on it and bring different ideas to the party, if you like. And whenever we're designing a service, it's really hard not to bring your assumptions into it. So we always try not to do that, but inevitably we start to think, this is how it might look, or I've seen something like this before. And especially when you're doing something quite innovative and new, it's really important to kind of have an open mind and be prepared to create something quite different to how you might expect it to be. So that's how we would tackle that particular question. Handing back to Kirsten for number 5.
And number 5 is, how can I change my offline process to an online process? So this is quite a big question for us here at Hyphen8. We would suggest that you need to think about it before immediately starting the build of a new system or a new form. The first thing we would suggest is to review the process. So ideally, you need to review the process as a whole first and consider how well it's working. There's no point taking across things that aren't working well and are frustrating people. Huge tip here is reduce complexity. So just duplicating an existing process without actually reviewing it means you're missing a critical opportunity to reduce inefficiencies and improve the experience for everyone who's involved. Another thing to point out is complexity makes systems and forms more complicated, more time consuming, more expensive to build, and harder to use and maintain in the long run. So we were probably all guilty of adding to processes over time. They can gather complexity and kind of snowball as they're added to by competing demands of different stakeholders. So we would suggest this is the time to rationalise. And to do that, tip number 3, map the existing process and identify the pain points first. You can do this from the point of view of your external users. So it's good to try and get some of your customers, your grantees, your applicants on board, as well as internal users. And try to make sure that all key stakeholders and teams are included and feel involved. And we'll be talking a bit more about that later. We'll also be talking more about the user journey mapping in a future webinar. So if you're interested in that and the best ways of doing it, we'll be able to give you some tips, hopefully next year. It can also be useful to observe people doing their jobs. So you might have some operational staff who are using your systems or your processes. Have a look at what they're doing, try and spot where they get frustrated or where work steps are duplicated and there's lots of waiting time. And, that'll help you to spot where things could be improved. And then you can use that user journey mapping and all of that research that you've done as a basis for redesigning your process. And redesign, it could be significant. So it could involve significant organisational redesign if you're up for that as an organisation and want to take that opportunity. Or it could just involve trying to reduce some of the complexity in the process. But either way, bear in mind that change management is part of the deal with going online or changing a system, and you need to be able to take people with you. So once you've got a process you're happy with, you can also think about user experience design, and that's to make sure that the touch points and interactions that those internal and external users have with your systems, websites and forms are intuitive and accessible. And then final thing is test with users, as you will hear us say multiple times. Before you actually launch something live, certainly before you launch it in volume or for longer term, make sure you test with your users. We've worked with quite a number of organisations of varying sizes, and you can see some of them on the next slide, to review offline forms and take them online. Typically, we often think of taking paper-based PDF or Word forms online, but we're also working with a number of these clients too, who are moving to a new system and can see the benefit of reviewing their entire end-to-end process first, rather than just lifting and shifting what they've already got, and then they might not be able to take advantage of the benefits that new tech can bring. So that's something definitely worth bearing in mind. So that was question 5. Moving on to question 6, we'll go over to Elaine.
So question 6 is, how can we ensure stakeholder buy-in of new systems and processes? So it's often the case that you actually might have a team or a number of people within the organization that want to consider service design or a system change, but actually there's some reluctance by certain stakeholders. So firstly, let's just think about why stakeholders may be a bit reluctant. The first thing is that everyone is guilty slightly of being happy staying in their comfort zone. They may have adopted bad workarounds throughout the years, and although their job may have elements that are very admin heavy or clunky, often when we ask the question, well, why do you go through so many steps? And the reply is, it's just the way things are done. So sometimes we can just be guilty of sticking with something that is comfortable to us rather than considering change. The other reason is that some people in the organization may have also had past unsuccessful experiences of a system change or even of service design where it hasn't gone as well as thought. The outcome wasn't really as expected. So that's actually tarnished their view of being involved again in a similar process. One of the key ones is that if people don't feel consulted or involved in a process, after all, they're going to be the end users who are using any new process or system, then it can feel that they are being imposed upon and nobody's consulted them and nobody's asked me what my challenges are. So it's really important that they are consulted throughout the process. And then fear what change means for them is that certain individuals may actually think, what could this change mean for my job role? Or will it change the things that I do every day? Or do I even have the right technical skills or abilities to adopt any new processes that are introduced? So if those are some of the common reasons for stakeholder reluctance, let's have a look at how we can address some of these. So the first thing is you have to first make sure that you're identifying who all the stakeholders are and what they actually need. There's going to be a whole array of people internally and externally that are going to be involved in this process and the service that you're providing. And it's really important that you ask them and consult them and make sure that you're addressing their challenges. And I'll come on to a future question, which is more about that. The second thing is early engagement. It's important to keep people involved throughout this journey. So making sure that there is some of that user consultancy. So Kirsten mentioned a few of these, but by doing some user testing, which could be anything from a user survey, it could just be having conversations with people, it could be active observation. There are all sorts of methods, but it's actually a way of having a look at what users' current challenges are and the pain points, and being able to share those internally can actually help stakeholders to understand what the issues are. The other thing is to identify ambassadors, but also resistors. In every team or organization, there are naturally going to be people that are more influential, that people listen to. And therefore, it's important to identify them early on so that you can get them on board and get them on side to actually help with some of the communications and the communications internally as well as externally. And that also involves getting the senior teams to cascade down positive messaging throughout the process. Any communications that go out, whether it's at the beginning about the goals of the or the objectives, or whether it's progress, have to be very transparent. So what you want to do is make sure that you're gaining and maintaining trust by all parties, and so make sure that you're very clear about what's going right, but also what's going wrong. So stakeholder buy-in is just one of the challenges or barriers to why you may not be able to start on the process of service design, but I will come on to some other barriers later. So thinking about the next question, number 7, how do we know if we need service design? So service design is something which has become, a bit of a buzzword in more recent years, but actually some organizations just don't understand how they identify whether it's needed. So, I would say as an obvious answer, everybody needs service design. And that is because user journeys constantly need to change to adapt to the changing world, to adapt to evolving technology. And we at Hyphen8 certainly have to always embark on service design to make sure that we're addressing our user needs. So it should be for life and not just for Christmas. Apologies for the cheesy phrase. But let's look at some of the ways that you can identify whether you do actually need service design, because there are some common things that kind of flag this. And one is, as Kirsten alluded to earlier, complex processes. You can often find that things have become multi-step, involving far too many people, involving lots of different systems, paper-based systems, whatever it may be. Things have become far too complex. So actually, the process of service design can really help to simplify that. The second thing is spending too much time on administration. So everybody wants to be freed up from manual data entry or duplication of data into more than one place, or having to process too many steps or gain approval from too many people. So actually, if you are spending too much time on admin, and that could be just the case of actually identifying whether that and asking your people that are involved in processes whether this is the case and how much time they're spending, that can be a reason why service design would be beneficial. This one is obviously been a very common one in recent times, the need to increase flexibility. Non-profits need to be able to adapt and introduce new programs at the drop of a hat. And a perfect example of that is COVID, where particularly for Hyphen8 working with a number of UK funders who needed to get out money and grants to causes that were addressing, COVID-related needs. There was really a need to increase speed, to be more flexible, to fire up new forms quickly, to fast track the money out the door. And so having a process and a system that allows you to fast track and be nimble and adapt to different circumstances can be a sign that service design is needed. And last but not least is transform user engagement. One of the objectives of service design is to improve the user experience, to make it a pleasant process for everyone involved, whether that is internal users or whether it is external users. So that could be making the grant application process easier, or if you've got donors, to serve them with relevant communications and make their donation experience easy. Or it could also mean internally making it a lot easier to automate processes that some of your internal staff don't need to chase things or remind things quite so often. So these are some of the ways in which we are kind of helping organizations to identify the need. But really the outcomes are that you're going to be able to simplify processes, improve user experience, reduce the time that you're spending on admin to free up time to build relationships and do the stuff that you would much rather be doing. So there are lots of benefits that come out of that process. So on to the next question, me again. Who should be involved in service design? So a number of these kind of responses have touched on how important it is to keep the people engaged in the process. So in this question, we're going to take a look at how you identify who should be involved. So the first thing is you need to make sure that you represent the different internal roles. And when we're mapping out processes and thinking about all the touch points throughout a user journey, it's important to consider that different internal roles have very different expectations, motivations, and goals. So whether it's somebody that is, in the senior management team, or whether it is somebody who's a day-to-day user of the system, or it could be someone in a finance role, it's really important to make sure that you consider who those different roles are. The external user journey is really important too. So as we're mapping out processes, there's going to be internal people and also external people. So for example, if we're thinking about it from a funder's perspective, there could be external assessors, for example, there could be grant applicants, there could be the grantees themselves, and there could be other people that get involved in the external approval process, like trustees. And it's important to consider how they are actually interacting with you and how easy you're making their life. So having a clear idea of who those external users are, and obviously identifying ones that can get involved in the process, is important. But it's also important to consider the variety of user needs. So within the different groups that you identify as being having needs within a service, it's also important not just to think about what their jobs are and what they need to do, but also the different personalities. So make sure that you involve someone that is less vocal, that don't come forward maybe as much as others. Make sure that you consider people who've got the time and capacity to get involved, and then that is supported. And also make sure that you cover anybody who've got very specific user needs. So they may not be large groups, but for example, people who've got visual impairments that have very specific accessibility needs. Now, a great way to actually help you to think about the groups of people that are going to be engaging with your services is to define user personas. And these are kind of archetypal users who represent the different groups of people that you are going to be engaged with. So here we have our beautiful little Christmas representation of Emma, Gloria, Gary, and Freddie. And these are examples of user personas that, for example, represent executives, a grant officer, or it could be, a fundraising officer for donation management, a grant applicant or a donor, a finance user. And actually, by having these mapped out in terms of, Freddie is a finance user. At what point do they need to engage in this process? When do they have to approve something? What systems will they be using? It's a really good way of having that represented and making sure that you're addressing all of the needs of everybody that's going to be involved. And we can, at Hyphen8, help you to define your user personas if you haven't already got those mapped out. So I'm going to hand back now to a fellow elf for question 9.
Thank you, Elaine. Question 9 is, how long does service design take? So people think that it can be a really long process that can go on for months, and that can add to some bit of reluctance to really go down that route, but or sort of a feeling like it's not for you if you've not got enough time or resource available. But we just wanted to make the point that any time spent on service design is valuable. You will get the money back. It doesn't need to take long if you don't have the time, resource, or budget, and there's all sorts of stuff you can do yourself. And that could be just from a day, as the little elf here says, because a lot of clients we work with just want us to work on improving a single application form. And that could just take a couple of weeks and only a few hours over those couple of weeks if that form isn't too complex. As we always say, just testing with a handful of users, just 3 to 5, can give you all the feedback you need to make a real difference to your service and to the usability of your form. If you want to do something quick yourselves that adds value, you can just spend an hour a month with a few key team members or stakeholders, reviewing what's working well for you at the moment and what's not working so well. What are those niggling things that have just been frustrating you for a while? What are the sort of biggest pain points for some of your team? And from that, you can just make a list of actions and then prioritize them by perhaps voting on them. And then just take the top one and see if there's anything that you can do about that. Just making one improvement is a good start. Or it could take a few days. So we've done work with some clients to review the impact their funding's having and how effectively they capture information about impact. And that's something that could be just a few days' work. Might be a couple of months in total, but only a few days' work to review the data they already have and make some recommendations on how to improve it. And then we, just spend another day or two to interview potentially a handful of grant holders about the longer term impact of the funding they received, and then write up a report on it. So that's not a big piece of work. It doesn't take a large amount of time. But, there's some people that will take a few months over it. And we work with some clients who've got the time and resource to do a more significant investment in review of their whole service. We can still do a light touch version of that takes a bit less time as well. When I worked at the National Lottery Community Fund, we spent quite a few months, might have even been a year, capturing feedback from users on our existing processes and mapping those pain points in more detail. And that helped us give a really good basis for redesigning our funding process and the forms before we started a Salesforce implementation. So really, there's all sorts of things you can do that add value regardless of time. And it's important to note that service design can be tailored to your needs. So it's a tool. It can fit in with your availability and your capacity. When working with our customers, we consider their peaks and troughs so that we make sure we fit around their availability and we can work to any deadlines that they have. For next question now, passing back to Elaine.
So question 10, what barriers can you experience in doing service design and how can they be overcome? So here we're going to look at 3 of the kind of main barriers that we hear when organizations or leadership are really have recognized the need to improve the user experience, or they want to actually look at service. But there may be some barriers that are to do with fear of, committing to the change, or some reluctance to actually embark on that process. So let's have a look at the first barrier, which is really that reluctance and fear of change of the stakeholders themselves. So the first one is that what we can do to mitigate that is that if you actually listen to organizations that have already been through this process, so talking to other nonprofits that are in a similar position and hear about their experiences, that can really help to alleviate any fear, to hear where there have been success stories or to understand what their challenges were. And sometimes that external voice, not just from other organizations, but also from a consultancy like Hyphen8, can really help to give some comfort that actually what internal people are saying has got a backup. You've got a kind of another voice that is saying, yes, there is a reason to be doing this. So we can always introduce organizations to other people who've been through the process and that you can speak to about why this should be a good idea. The next thing we can do is to make sure that, it's back to the point earlier really, is about communicating really early on what the goals are and really what the tangible benefits are. So what are the benefits to you as an individual, or you as to the different users of the system? And it could be cost savings. It could be we're going to massively reduce admin. It could be that we're going to be able to raise more funds or serve more grant applicants, or whatever it may be. Really important that you set the scene at the beginning to say there's a really compelling reason why we need to do this, and then to keep that communication going throughout on progress. And the third thing is show and tells. So what we like to do throughout any kind of service design process is to show information, analysis, results very early on. Sometimes if you're doing user testing and you're getting some real good information about what the current challenges are, and you're sharing that with some of the reluctant stakeholders, it really helps to paint a picture of why we're doing this and why it's so important that they kind of set their fears to one side. The second barrier is cost implications. Obviously, money is an important factor, particularly for nonprofit organizations. And there is a perception that service design, and obviously any technical project that comes out of the back of it, will cost a lot of money. The first thing is that, as Kirsten was mentioning earlier about the time it takes, it doesn't mean that it's necessarily expensive and long in duration. What we always do at Hyphen8 is plan an approach that meets your budget. So we can make suggestions based on any budget limitations and address those. So it's certainly not the case that one size fits all. We don't just have a set kind of way of doing service design. It can be flexed. The second thing that we can do is actually give you some comfort that if you do service design, it is likely to reduce implementation costs, because during a technology implementation, if we're already streamlining the processes and cutting out kind of admin heavy steps and reducing the number of forms and making it more efficient, the likelihood is that the technical implementation as a result will be less time and therefore less money. And the third thing is that it's always really important upfront to paint that business case picture and to convince the board and the people with the checkbooks what the return on investment will be. And we're very used to helping to create those business cases if you need our help with those, because it's really important that we're going to be able to say, why are we doing this? What's it going to help us with? What might it reduce in terms of costs? So that's certainly something that we can help with. And then the third barrier is time and capacity. Again, a very important consideration, not just for service design, but for any kind of project that you're embarking on. There's no getting away from the fact that you are going to need to give some of your internal time to a service design process, whether it's in discovery sessions, in user research, and actually feeding into the process. So let's look at some of the things that we can do to address that. The first thing is planning ahead to identify the level of involvement needed. This goes back to those user personas, is that depending on who you are in the process, you may not need to give as much time to the service design, and you may only need to be involved in one element of it. as opposed to a kind of user that is very heavily going to be involved in processes and systems, which may have a higher level of involvement. So it's important that we can identify what those user groups are, who is going to be representing them, and actually try and quantify that level of involvement so that we can have some realistic conversations about how much capacity they will need. The second thing is working our time that we do the activities around workload peaks and troughs. So again, going back to what Kirsten said earlier about the timings of this, we're always very cognizant of the fact that everyone is busy and that you do have certain times where you just cannot give time to this sort of activity. So we would work with you to put together a plan that considers when the downtimes might be, considers when you're not going to be available, and to work around that and come up with a mutual plan. And then the last thing is that it's really important that we help you to get management support for the allocation of time to this process. It's not going to be any good if you're expected to do your day job alongside quite intensive involvement in a service design process. So we sometimes see that people become a bit frazzled because they're trying to balance the two. It's really important that, going back to that planning ahead, that we actually have some really transparent conversations and help to have those communications with management so that they can be supporting that you will have some time allocated if you're going to be one of those users that is involved in this process. So hopefully what we can do is, because we've done this so many times and we've heard about all the barriers so many times, we can certainly help you right at the beginning to address them and put together communications and plans that are suitable for your organization. So back to Ange.
Thanks, Elaine. So I officially think this is the hardest question of the 12. What is a great example of service design? And I think I've been thinking about why this is a difficult question to answer. And I think one of the reasons is that we often don't notice good service design. So if I think about services that I notice, it's often when they go wrong or they're frustrating me. For example, I have a current leak in my roof that's been happening for a while now, and it's suddenly got worse. And I'm trying to deal with various workmen and getting parts, which is difficult due to COVID. So that whole service experience for me has been really frustrating. And I'm sure you have many examples from this year of things that have been frustrating. Maybe your train's been cancelled, you're trying to renew your broadband and you're stuck in a holding pattern for ages. All those kind of things make us notice services. But often when they go really well, we just don't notice them at all because they don't affect our lives. There's a book here on the screen called Good Services by Lou Down, which if you haven't read it, I'd really recommend it. And this goes through I think it's 15 principles of good services. And this outlines all the things that make a service good. And actually, when you follow all of these principles, you have services that people almost just don't notice because it's so seamless. And there's 4 things here that I pulled out from the principles. So a good service is easy to find. So if you Google for it, you'll find it easily, or it's named in a way that makes sense. It requires no prior knowledge. You can just rock up and use the service without needing to know stuff in advance. The steps are at a minimum, so it's taking you the least amount of time to access the service, and it enables you to achieve what you need to do. So we've been thinking about good services and what would be a good example for today. We've come up with one that's related to Christmas, and this is the Royal Mail Collect Your Post service, which you may or may not have come across. And at the moment, partly because I'm not going to see quite so many people this year for Christmas because of COVID, I've got a lot of parcels to wrap up and send. And so this service is really helpful, especially if you're working during the day and it's hard to get to the post office. They'll just come to your house, collect the parcels from you and post them, which is brilliant. And there's a couple of things about this service that I think are really nice, the way that they've thought about the user experience and done those things that I've just described about. I didn't need any prior knowledge, but the steps are at a minimum, and it enables me to do what I need to do, even if I have different circumstances. So, for example, when I go on there, if I say I've got 3 parcels, please can you come and collect them and post them to people who are going to be delighted to receive these gifts. If I've got a printer, brilliant, I can print out my own label, stick it on the box, but I actually don't have a printer. And so they've thought about that in the service, and you can say, I don't have a printer, please can Santa print the labels on his Royal Mail sleigh and bring them to my door? And that's exactly what happens, which is brilliant. And then they also have thought about what happens if you're going to be out. So if you're going to be out, you can tick a box and say, I'm going to be away from home, but I'm going to leave my parcels in a safe place. And you can say what that safe place is, and then they'll collect them from that place and take them off for you. So it's a really nice example of a really seamless service where they've really thought about the user experience and the different types of users that might be accessing it. So moving on to our last question of the day. I feel like I should be singing on the 12th day of Christmas, but I'll save you from that. This is what new trends are on the horizon. So obviously we've learned from the pandemic, it's really difficult to predict the future, but we've thought of a few things here that have been bubbling up in the conversations we've been having as this year's gone on, and we imagine will continue into 2022. So we've got a picture here of the Modern Grant Making book by Gemma Bull and Tom Steinberg, who actually Kirsten and I used to work with previously at the National Lottery Community Fund. And you probably can't read the text in the middle, but it says a guide for funders who believe better is possible. And this book came out this year, and it's definitely provoked quite a lot of conversation. It's got some thought-provoking, interesting ideas in here about how grant making can be shaped. It talks about grant making as a service. It picks up on quite a few of the things that we've talked about today. And a couple of things on this slide connected to some of the themes in the book. So the first one is #FixTheForm. So Kirsten's already mentioned that forms have been a big theme this year. It's definitely the thing we've talked the most about. And we would imagine that continuing as a trend into next year. And the #FixTheForm movement, which you might have seen, is really pushing funders to think about how they do their forms. So whether they need to ask all the questions they're asking, if they're asking them in the right way, if they're making the process as easy as possible. It's starting to ask challenging questions about whether funders can have share forms. So people are just filling in one form and it goes to multiple funders rather than doing a different one for each funder. And there's also, connected to this, a bit of conversation that's been happening this year that we would see going into next year around whether forms are always the right thing. So moving to a more relational approach and thinking about how there are different ways to make your grants. So forms will definitely, I think, be a big feature. And then on the right-hand side, we've got a quote that I took from Esme Fairbairn's Twitter. And this is an interesting thing they've been doing this year, which also I'd see as a trend, which is around reporting. And so they decided that instead of asking everybody to complete their own report form, the Esme Fairbairn report form, people could submit in any format they wanted. And I think I took this about 2 months ago. And at that point, 133 organisations had taken them up on that offer. So they hadn't filled in Esme's form. They just sent something in their own format. And you can imagine the amount of time that's saved. I don't know how long people generally spend filling in Esme's form, but we've been doing quite a bit of work recently on forms, and people can spend, a whole day filling in a form, or even just half a day, but all that times 133 organisations is a lot of time that people have saved. And that's brilliant because those people can be doing the things that they want to be doing rather than sitting at a desk and filling in forms. So that's another trend that we would see moving forward. And then we've got a couple of other things here, relational and randomised grant making. So the relational grant making I've already referred to with the Fix the Form, and this is definitely gaining traction. Just this morning, talking to another funder about how they would like some service design help to develop a more relational approach and looking at how they can work in partnership. So trying to move the power dynamics so it's not the funder being all powerful, but it's very much working together to shape ideas and shape the future of how the funding should be spent. So I imagine that will continue to grow. And the randomised grant making, I would say, is less of a trend at the moment, but something that sparked my interest this year. And I'm going to be interested to see if and how it develops in 2022. So there's some examples this year of funders who've got high volume, low value awards. So they're making lots of grants of small amounts of money, and they're doing it in a randomized kind of lottery way. So the applications come in and all they do is check that they're eligible. So if their funding is just for charities, they'll come in, they'll check that they are a charity, they're applying for below the amount of money that they've said. If it's a maximum 10,000, that it's coming under that. A few little checks, but they don't look at all at the quality of it. They're not assessing it. They're not taking it to any decision meetings. They're stripping out all of that cost, if you like, to the funder. They're saying this is just low value. These are low value grants that can really help organizations, but we're not going to invest a massive amount of time in looking at them. We're just going to make those grants. So they put them then into a lottery and they make as many as they can based on the maximum amount of funding that they've got. And then they just let people know you've been successful or you haven't been. So I'm going to be interested to see how that grows or doesn't grow in 2022 as those findings come out from that early work that they've been doing. So that brings us to the end of our 12 questions of Christmas. So now we move into the Q&A. So Johnny, who's doing all the technical magic, and did all of our designs brilliantly for us today, is managing the questions. So Johnny, I don't know if you've got any questions that you want to bring up for us. All right, question 1. What do you do if more than one person wants to collaborate on a form before submitting? This is a question we've had a bit this year. Kirsten, would you like to answer that one?
Yeah, I can give it a go. Well, this isn't uncommon at all. As Andrew says, it's something that comes up quite a bit. And from what I understand, with the Fix the Form, it was the number one thing that people were interested in, because so often there'll be a number of parties that are contributing to a form, so they're all going to want to input. Really, there's 2 main ways of doing that. Well, 3 if you include the main old-fashioned way, which is just handing around a piece of paper, which isn't always that efficient. You could send people a PDF copy of a form, old-fashioned way, and get them to fill it in, pass it around. Everyone contributes, or a Word document which they add comments on. Or there is lots of possibilities with technology these times at the moment, such as Salesforce Community or Experience Clouds, I think it's called now. So it's having some kind of portal where you're able to send out a link to the form, and then multiple people can have logins to that form and are able to sort of contribute to it. So that means that you can have more than one person contributing at any one time. So that's pretty good. Is that everything? Can anyone think of anything else? Or
no, I think that's good.
Okay. Well, that's that question then.
Johnny, any others? Okay, how do you know when you should make iterations and when you should leave it as it is? All right, this is one of my favorite questions, partly because I used to be a product owner at the National Lottery Community Funds. I used to have to prioritize things that came in for the backlog. And so I guess there's a few things I would say on this one. So the first one is that whenever you get feedback that something's broken, you should just make an iteration and fix it like immediately. So if your form's not working for some reason, or a particular thing is broken, then that's something to act on really quickly. In terms of kind of bigger things, so maybe you're starting to think that your decision process is just a bit clunky, you've had a bit of feedback, the committee aren't really enjoying it, the way it works, or, getting bits of feedback, then it starts to flag in your mind that this is something you probably should look into a bit further. So then I would want to do a little bit more research. So we'll get some stuff that just comes in, but then that flags to us that we probably want to dig into it a bit deeper. And then we would make an iteration on the back of that. So we would always want to be a bit careful that we're not just iterating for the sake of it, or we're just iterating based on one bit of feedback that we've had, unless it's feedback that something's broken. Otherwise, we're going to want to just spend a little bit of time thinking a bit more about that and which priority we might want to put on things. Cool. Johnny, any others? What small things can we do if we want to do service design but lack time or money? Elaine, do you want to take this one?
Okay. So I think the first thing is going back to what Kirsten said earlier about, having just regular meetings to actually talk about your user needs and challenges. Sometimes we live in our bubbles in the different teams and we don't even get to know what each other are experiencing. So I think what you could do is just set aside some time, whether it's on a monthly or a quarterly basis, to actually just have a conversation about what are the things which have taken us the most time. Have we had any user feedback, etc.? But sometimes I think as well, it just means getting a fresh pair of eyes on things. So think about if you have got maybe data capture forms that you use throughout your processes, get someone else to look at them and test them and play with them from a different perspective. And you might actually get some intelligence out of that to suggest, oh, we thought everything was fine with that, but actually they're feeding back that it's a nightmare. So I think definitely doing a bit of dipping your toe in the water of doing some user research. You could even do a simple survey that just asks a few simple questions about, what are the areas that you're challenged with at the moment or whatever. So I think there's a few things that you can do that you've picked out of the different responses that we've given today that don't need to be done externally. They could just mean making a bit of time internally.
Brilliant. Fab. Johnny's just sent me a little message to say that was the last question. So thanks everyone for joining. We are already planning our next webinars for 2022. So we've got one that we're going to be doing on journey mapping that we mentioned at a previous webinar. And we've got some special guests hopefully coming as well to another one. So all will be revealed on that shortly. So thanks everyone for joining, and yeah, have a happy Christmas.
Happy Christmas.
Happy Christmas, everyone.